Chris woke with a start, smothering a cry. Another damn dream. One with the foul new deity cackling maliciously as men, women, and children died fighting against some kind of strangling vine. He rubbed his face, his winter beard softly scratching against his cheeks. And the story's reoccurring dreams were warnings of things to come, foretellings. But he couldn't make himself believe that. A strangling vine to pull down all structures, to give animals more strength and intelligence. Since the electricity had quit 3 months ago, the wolves and bears were already more aggressive. Now they were going to get smarter, too. If his dreams really were visions of the future, how could he tell anyone? He was pretty sure everybody was about half afraid of him losing his mind already. His family were only nominally Christians, barely going to church on special occasions. Yet the tenets of that faith regulated their lives just as surely as if they were stout believers. Any mention of Sandpet or Freymatuk was always received with rolled eyes. Even though he'd been right about the electricity not coming back, if he made any attempt to speak of the two deities, he was dismissed out of hand. A glance out the basement window told him that it was still early afternoon. He'd only been asleep for a few hours. He hated having to sleep during the day. The fire that now lived inside him was called Tarin. The dreams had told him that much. He was discovering more and more of the ways it had changed him, like the fire he could throw from his hands. Another was that he was now able to see heat signatures. So when the cows had started calving in earnest, Chris, being the only one who could get anything done without the big yard lights that no longer worked, had been relegated to night caver. Before he could grab the battered paperback novel beside his bunk and try to read himself back to sleep, he heard Roland clatter down the basement steps. The curtain, which provided a small amount of privacy, moved to reveal his best friend's face. "Get up, bud. There's a strange girl and your mama says you might know her." "A strange girl? Where'd she come from and how?" "Ada and I found her. Half passed out just on the other side of the fence, where the hay pasture meets the county road." Getting dressed, Chris gave his friend a sideways look. Roland and Ada, Chris's sister, were experts at finding little spots of privacy while doing their share of the ranch work. It was a small point of envy for Chris, though he roundly approved of their match. His youngest sister, Letty, had gladly hooked up with Roland's younger brother, Tuff, which left Chris a wobbly fifth wheel. He could attach himself to their permanent house guest, Crazy Kaylee, but he just couldn't find any respect for her. She stubbornly held on to her self-aggrandizing title of influencer, and she brandished her phone as if it weren't as dead as everyone else's, often in the most inappropriate moments. Chris followed his slightly shorter yet heavier-muscled friend up the stairs to the ranch house's living room. As he entered, the room's warmth enveloped him. The large wood stove against the back wall was filled, as usual, with several steaming pots. Telling by the aroma, supper would be noodles and beef. Again. His eyes were pulled to the form lying on the large couch. Even from the door, he could feel a resonance. It was almost as though his Tarin recognized the girl, not personally, but as a kindred. Puzzled, he approached, passing by his mother sitting on a little footstool beside the girl. Could this be Freymatuk, the female deity of his dreams? But no, she couldn't. Freymatuk always mourned, even grieved, and she was no longer allowed on Earth, no longer allowed to help her beloved humans. He stepped closer and carefully guided the strands of dirty, matted brown hair away from the girl's grimy face. By the shape of her eyes and the darker tinge of her skin, she looked to be of at least some Latino heritage. Across her brow and cheeks were the same fever scars as his. However, hers were in a slightly different pattern. Their color was tinged blue instead of red. When he touched her, the Tarin inside him gave another tingle of recognition. He took his mother's shoulder and pulled her away from the unconscious girl. "Be careful, Ma. Don't let her touch you. She can kill you." As Mackenzie turned her brown eyes to her son, she put on a smile of patient amusement, her sandy brown hair trailing in a braid out the back of her baseball cap. "Like you tried to kill us when you were in your fever? I think I got this." "No, you don't," Ma. You can't just dip her hands in water and have everything be fine. Mackenzie gave a wry laugh. What do you mean, everything be fine? You were trying to set our trailer house on fire. She scoffed loudly, shaking his hand away. Everything be fine. Just glad your dad thought of the water buckets. It wasn't fair of her to throw his fever in his face. He couldn't control himself when he was unconscious. Since then, they'd benefited from his transformation 10 times over. The water he melted in frozen stock tanks, the many projects on the ranch he'd welded or cut iron for, and his firesight that allowed him to see in even the darkest night. His mother gasped. Did you just roll your eyes at me? She stood before him, disbelief at his rudeness playing across her expression. He gave her a crooked grin as he ran a hand through his auburn hair. Yeah, Ma. Next you're going to want to tell me about the 15 hours of labor you had the night I was born. She pointed her finger at him. 17, you insolent pup. Then she answered his grin with one of her own, before adding, all I'm saying is, and I'm well aware of the danger. He pointed at the buckets of water. Get those out of here. This girl handles water, not fire. She might just take it and shove it up your nose and mouth. With a small gasp, Roland came to carry the buckets to the kitchen. Crazy Kaylee, her pink phone held out before her, narrated everything in a low voice. Mackenzie turned to glare at her, pointed a threatening hand, and the influencer girl quickly stuffed her device into the back pocket of her jeans. From her seat at the kitchen table, with Letty and Tuff in their customary spots beside her, Ada asked, Do you know who she is? When we found her and brought her in, she said her name was Jessalyn, but not much more. She's been passed out ever since. His sister was tall, like their mother, and had the same brown eyes. Her hair was as dark as their father's, though, while Chris's was sandy brown like their mother. Shaking his head, Chris answered, I know what she is, but no, I've never seen her before. She all right? His mother sighed, gathering the strands that had escaped her thick braid and tucking them behind her ears. I can't see any obvious injuries. As far as I can tell, she's just sleeping, exhausted. Chris said, I think you'll be safe as long as you keep water away and don't touch her. I don't think she can reach as far as I can. His mother tucked the sleeping girl under the thick comforters and quilts. What do you mean? Chris stood back out of the way. You know how I can throw my fire about 40 yards out? I don't think she can. He rubbed a hand over the line of scars across his brow. Matter of fact, I think she can only affect what's close around her. At his mother's questioning look, he added, I don't know how I know that, and I could be wrong, so be careful. As an exceptionally strong gust of Wyoming wind shook the house, there came a scratching at the door, followed by a canine whine and more scratching. Letty rose from her chair and opened the door. A red and white dog, about the same size as their own cow dogs, jetted between her legs. The little guy cast about the room, found Jessalyn, and with a long jump landed on her sleeping form. He nosed her face anxiously, then looked at the rest of the people in the room. With a cautious expression, he laid down on top of his girl. Letty quickly followed after him, reaching to take him by the scruff of his neck. No dogs in the house, little one. Sorry. Their mother put up a staying hand. Let him take a look around. He just wants to know his girl is safe. We can cook him out after a little while. When another gust of wind shook the house, she looked out the big living room window. A large front of dark gray clouds was building over the western ridges. How are y'all doing on your work? Roland, having taken Letty's seat beside Ada, answered. We just had to drag another bale into the horse crowd and do the evening chores. With none of the tractors or any of the other vehicles working anymore, the hay bales had to be moved by horses, heaved laboriously to their spots. Chris's mother stood to look out the window, contemplating the storm front moving in. Let the others finish, Roland. You ride up the ridge where you can see the highway. See if you can spot Bruce and Trin coming back. The two men had joined several others from up the creek to take quite a few cows to town. Roland nodded, then rose to do her bidding. Crazy Kaylee took her pink phone out of her back pocket and quickly swiped the glass screen with practiced fingers. Even though the screen remained black and lifeless, she clung to using her device as if nothing had changed. It says here that the clouds are just a little bit of precipitation, less than half an inch of snow. She continued, swiping the black screen, then added, "Do you want me to call them to see where they are?" Rolling her brown eyes, Chris's mother answered, "That's all right, Kaylee. I'm sure they'll be here soon. Thanks. Now, why don't you put that phone away and finish taking the ashes out of the stove?" She turned towards Chris, but indicated the unconscious girl on the couch. "I'll be careful, son. Why don't you go back to sleep? With that storm front moving in, we'll have calves dropping left and right, and you'll be the only one who can see the cows tonight." Shrugging, he returned to his bunk in the basement. With any luck, you might be able to catch a couple more hours of dreamless sleep. The night was long, for sure. The storm descended on Grass Creek, sweeping snow across the pastures and corrals. 7 new calves had been born for the heifers in the lot below the barn. Chris had to help 2 of them. Luckily, those had been easy pulls, and he'd not had to wake anyone else. He didn't even know how the older cows on the hay meadow had fared. He'd left those to the others to manage as part of their daytime chores. Now it was mid-morning, and his mother had woken him. Something on the old chute had broken, and he needed to repair it. As he got his chore coats on, he noticed the strange girl was no longer sleeping on the living room couch. Crazy Kaylee sat at the kitchen table, cranking the manual blade they'd attached to an old blender milling corn to be cooked. Turning to her, he asked, "Did the new girl leave already?" Kaylee stopped to shake the contents inside the glass. "No, she's still out cold. But she was in the way on the couch, so Roland and Tuff moved her to your mother's bed this morning." Her pink phone lay on the table by her side. The screen was black, of course. Nevertheless, her nimble fingers swept across the screen. "I haven't been able to reach Trin or Bruce. They won't even answer my texts." Chris sighed. He wasn't up to making the black-haired girl face reality. Again. For the 50th time since the power had gone out. "They're probably in a dead spot. Don't worry, they'll be home soon." He knew it didn't have anything to do with him, but he felt a little cowardly. He shouldn't allow her to keep living inside a delusion. Pulling his hoodie over his head and zipping his coat a little higher to help protect from the snow, he charged into the blustery day outside. As he made his way across the yard, Trin's old cow dog, Tilly, rose from her spot under the porch and fell in his wake. During the lonely night, watching the calving heifers, she had been his most faithful companion. While the 2 Richter dogs, Rusty and Tidbit, sometimes lazily lounged by the warm stove in the tack room, Tilly never missed an opportunity to help Chris. The new girl's little pup, still soft and wiggly in the pre-adult stage, also emerged from his shelter under the porch. The little guy begged for a pat on the head, but very quickly returned to his relatively dry spot. The sound of cows bawling for their calves met Chris as he approached the barn, carrying over the sound of little icy snowflakes pelting the sides of the buildings. As he entered, Roland grinned at him and made some snide remark, but his words were drowned out by a particularly loud call from one of the mothers. The youngster kids sat on fence rails, laughing and teasing each other as they waited. A steaming milk pail sat on an oil barrel out of the reach of the dogs, and Ada stood beside it, batting at the barn cats who tried to jump up to get at their favorite treat. Milking a quart of milk from each of the cows before letting them go to suckle their calves was the 4 kids' first chore each morning. They were still not done, showed they must have tried to make the broken chute work for quite a while before giving up and calling Chris. But they needn't have. He loved using his Tarin. Letting the fire run through him was exhilarating. Roland jumped off his corral rail and demonstrated the broken head catch. The old chute had been brought back up from what was called the graveyard and resurrected a couple months ago. The big modern hydraulic one now sat just outside the barn. Even with the horse's help, it had been too heavy to move far. And now it sat there, a big piece of equipment, good for nothing. On the old chute, the broken piece could be replaced. Without the normal electrical saws, grinders, and drills, the job would take the 4 youngsters hours. However, using the fire that was now such a part of him, Chris could get his sisters and the 2 Emerson brothers back up and running again in minutes. He took a cup and poured himself some milk. As he drank, the dogs followed his every motion with pleading eyes. You'll get yours later, he promised. Tough jumped off the fence. I already got your tools for you, and this piece of iron, will it work? The younger Emerson brother had always had a small case of big brother worship for Chris. He smiled his thanks at the kid and, using the tools from the bucket, took the broken piece loose. Laying it out on the packed dirt of the barn, he marked the replacement piece and the holes that needed to be drilled. Then, concentrating fire to a tight line through his bare fingers, he cut the piece to size. Feeling his Tarin course through him, controlling its power, he felt all that elation. He loved this. He knew his eyes glowed. The marks across his cheeks were swollen and hot, yet the power running through his hands was pure gratification. The younger kid watched, his expression green with envy. Chris sat back and looked at the result. Looks a little rough, don't you think, Tough? His young friend nodded. Definitely rough, Chris. Better smooth it out a bit. Damn it, Chris. Just call it good and put it on, Roland objected. We got work to do. Chris picked up the hot iron with his bare hand and carried it to the shoeing anvil. He was impervious to heat now, but he still needed the tools to help smooth out the edges. Once more, letting the ecstasy run through him, he heated the bar's edges white hot, then he used the hammer to pound them smooth. He searched for an explanation Roland would accept. This is my work. If I ever leave and you guys tell folks that I fixed the chute, I want it to be right. Roland rolled his eyes. As if you would ever leave. We're all stuck here now. We're all needed here. In a small voice, Ada added, And where would you go? Chris didn't reply. How could he tell his friends that the dreams that weren't outright terrifying told him he had to find a place to the north and west? Holding up the piece of the pliers, he brought it to the chute. Now it could be bolted in place, and the milking could resume. Soon, the waiting, bawling mothers would be reunited with their hungry calves. Peripherally, he noticed Ada grimace and shudder as she sat on her fence rail. With the Tarin still in his eye, he knew the scars across his cheeks and brow were swollen and gleaming red. He turned and lunged towards her. He gave a silly monster roar as he made to put his hands on her cheeks. She jumped down with a scream and ducked away from him. Smiling, he turned to Letty. Giggling, she also jumped off her fence rail to run past him, ducking and turning and screeching in mock fear. Growling fiercely, he chased after his sisters in the small confines the area used to work cattle. Tough and Roland joined the chase, trying to catch the girls to hold for Chris. Neither of the boys missed this chance to get their arms around them and hold them close. But one of the cows spooked at the loud sounds and running youngsters. Panicked, she tried to jump out of her calving stall and almost succeeded. Oh my God, Ada laughed. The dads are going to be so pissed if she breaks a panel and gets out. Still laughing, with his thick black hair escaping under the woolen rancher cap, Roland said, All right. Come on, guys, we better get the milking done. We still have to feed hay after this. They would be feeding all the cows by themselves today. The two fathers, Bruce and Trin, were still not back from their own trip. And with this weather, they, along with the 5 other hands from further up the creek, might be delayed for days. They'd put together about 20 head to donate to the townsfolk between the 3 ranches, and the trip there was more than 40 miles. Chris's father said he thought their horses might be tough enough to return in one day. We'll have to see, he said in his deep voice. Horses ain't what they were 100 years ago. Since the 50s, we've been breeding for docile and pretty, not for long-distance travel. He'd explained with a small shake of his head. Most people today couldn't even ride them bastards from way back when. With the 2 men were gone, the kids were thankful they only had to keep up with the most basic needs of the cattle. Even so, the work would take until dark. Looking at the continuing storm, Chris said, Roland, why don't you and I go start rolling out the bales for the cows? Ada, Letty, Tough can finish the milking. His friend took up his bow and his quiver of arrows. Stowing them in the carrier Chris had fashioned for his saddle, he said, Thanks, bro. That'll help. As they rode their horses to the hay pen, Tilly, Rusty, and Tidbit followed them. It was harder to pull out the bales and unroll them in the pastures with just the 2 of them, but in this weather, every minute counted. Pounding the special bar Chris had made through the snow-clad bale, Roland said, I can't wait for spring. Then we can go turn the cows on the grass. We won't have to do this anymore." As they worked, the storm began to subside. While the snowflakes were still drifting down lazily on the diminished breeze, a long moment of clear sunlight broke through the clouds. The air warmed dramatically. The two friends stopped for a moment to look out at the beauty of the bright, snow-covered primordial ridges. Suddenly, the dogs jetted away from them and into the pasture. Barking and snarling, they ran toward a coyote that had slunk through the fence. Roland took up the rope to pull the bale into the pasture. "That boy is pretty gutsy to come so close while we're right here." Chris took up the rope and dallied to the horn of his saddle. "Didn't take the coyotes long to figure out our guns ain't working anymore, did it?" He tipped his head at the canine predator and added, "They would never have been this bold before." As the wily scavenger departed, the ranch dogs returned, wagging their tails and begging for approval. As they dragged the bale between them, Roland said, "It's been a long winter, and cold. All the predators are hungry." Chris replied, "No kidding. I hear a wolf pack almost every night. When they start howling, all the cows are up and calling their calves close. Some nights, the mamas don't get any sleep at all." Worry playing over his face, Roland said, "You think Bruce and Dad be all right? Wolves won't get them, will they?" Chris shook his head. He didn't know. So he repeated the empty comforts he held for himself. "Your dad is pretty deadly with that big crossbow of his. And my dad has his takedown bow. They got plenty of help. The two Sedekins plus Keith Brown Bear and his two sons." Roland shooed the cows away from the bale and cut the net. They would collect it once the hay was spread out. "I'm glad Woody and Jack went with them. Those two were fierce." Rolling out bale after bale and having to get on and off their horses for each part of the chore, they sure were glad when Ada, Letty, and Tuff joined them. Now, with an extra person to pound the bar through the bales and hook the ropes, plus another to cut the net and collect it in the pasture, Roland sent Chris back to the house. Chris smiled to see Tilly follow him. She would sleep under the porch until it was time to help him during the night. When Chris got up that evening for his night watch, the kitchen was bustling with activity. His sisters and the two Emerson brothers crowded around the counters where his mother had laid out the dishes for their supper. Mackenzie stood back, spooning gravy from an extra bowl for those who wanted it, while Crazy Kaylee cut little squares from a pan of cornbread. Things were more subdued than usual, since their new visitor already sat at the table, drinking from a large glass of fresh milk. She was dressed in what looked to be Letty's clothes, and an empty bowl of beef and noodles sat before her. Her black hair still looked dull and rough after so many days of neglect, but it was combed and tied in a neat bun against her head. A line of little scars across her cheeks and brow, so similar to his own, seemed to be relaxed. No swelling or coloration indicated the girl's Tarin was rising inside her. She looked up as he passed by her to dish up his own meal. This girl had had a rough time of it. There were still dark circles under her eyes, and she seemed pale. As she regarded him warily, she said, "Tarin." Her inflection made the word into a greeted title. Raising his brows, he nodded his affirmative and returned the greeting. "Tarin." Roland, bringing his plate and glass of milk to the table, rolled his eyes. "Oh, I feel like I'm in a Lord of the Rings movie. Next you guys are going to start speaking in Elvish." There was a momentary hush as everyone gaped, but when Letty giggled, they joined in the laughter. "Oh, that would be dope," she said, bringing her plate to sit next to their new guest. "I know a few Elvish words. I love how they sound." Jessalyn smiled and gathered her black hair behind her neck. "Sorry, Letty, I don't know any Elvish." Then she turned pleading eyes on their mother. "Miss Mackenzie, would you mind if I went back to bed? I'm still so tired. I feel like I can't keep two thoughts together." Chris's mother put down her plate in her customary spot. "Sure, hon. I don't blame you." With a gesture at the rest of them, she added, "I will fill my peanut gallery in on what you've told me so far." The girl took her dishes to the sink and then disappeared into Chris's parents' room to a chorus of good nights. Ada paused, eating the savory beef and noodles, fixing a gaze on her mother. "What are you going to sleep tonight?" Mackenzie made an offhand gesture. "It's a big bed. There's plenty of room for both of us." Chris immediately objected. "No, Mama, don't. I have nightmares. I would guess she does as well. She might not even know she's doing it, but she could take all the water from your body with a simple touch." His mother shrugged as if it didn't matter, but when she said, "All right, I'll take your bed for the night," he breathed a sigh of relief. As they ate, their mother filled them in on what the girl had told her so far. Jessalyn had come all the way up from Torrington. She'd fled there because the town had turned to total lawlessness. She'd found a horse and was making her way towards Cody, where her father lived. She'd also hoped to find her mother, who lived in Powell with Jessalyn's stepdad, but her horse had been killed by wolves not 10 miles from Grass Creek. The pack had chased her into one of the sheds used by the oil people. There, she'd spent several days, forced to physically block the door to keep the wolves' terrible hunger at bay. Eventually, the predators left, and Jessalyn and her little dog ran for it. While stumbling onto the first ranch she found, she collapsed from sleep exhaustion. Later, Ada and Roland noticed the little red and white dog nosing about one of the hay pastures. When they'd investigated, they'd followed the little dog to the unconscious girl's side. They put her up on one of the horses, Clory, probably, he was good for that kind of thing, and brought her home for Mackenzie to tend. Chris ate the rich, tasty food on his plate, thinking of the questions he was dying to ask the girl. But they would have to wait until the other Tarin woke again. When he went down to the barn, the night passed uneventfully for the most part. Tilly helped him, while Rusty, Tidbit, and Sets lazed around the tack room's warm stove. Although in all fairness, the younger dogs helped during the day while Tilly slept under the porch. He was pleased with his bay colt's progress. Mac gained more experience with every cow they brought into the barn. Morning rose over the high mountains, the sun tinting the snow-covered crags in orange light. He headed Mac into the hay meadow for one last circle around the older cows. As he arranged the McCarty rein over the colt's neck and shook out the fringe of his chinks, Chris relished the feel of the powerful, lively horse maneuvering through the heavy snow. Inexperienced as Mac was, his 4 feet were still a lot better than Chris's own, too. As he guided Mac to open the green iron gate, all the cow dogs, Rusty, Tidbit, Sets, as well as old Tilly, heard the telltale clang and sprang to join him. They eagerly ran around and with him, jumping through the fresh snow, their tongues lolling and their eyes bright. Normally, in the days before the old world had come crashing to a halt, daylight savings time would soon start. He doubted that now. With all the old rules no longer applicable, folks would hold to that. For all his life, it had been a despised practice. As he approached the cows, he slowed the colt to a walk. Something was wrong. The older, experienced mothers were up and huddled closely together. The ones that already had calves stood watching something alertly, their babies close by their flanks. When he found what held their attention, he silently cursed himself for leaving his bow at the barn. Several wolves loped soundlessly across the flat to the south, fluidly slipping between the mounds of snow-covered sage. As Chris watched, they ran across the iced-over creek and crossed the barbed wire fence into the hayfield. Then they began to circle the cows. Bunching tighter, the mothers bawled threateningly and lowered their heads toward the loping figures of death. Chris put the colt into a run. As the dogs struggled to keep up with him through the deep snow, he tried to calculate the best approach to the threatened herd. If he ran his horse up too fast, he would scatter them. That would give the wolves a better chance of getting to the newborn babies. For a moment, he fervently wished the old firearms were still working, or that he'd thought to bring his bow from the barn. He just didn't have that kind of range with his Tarin. But he'd been practicing, and he had a good understanding of how far his Tarin would reach. He would need to get close, within 30 or 40 yards, and he counted 8 wolves. He would need to be precise. Just when the cows began to notice him, he slowed his colt. One of the apex predators dashed forward and managed to separate a calf. The little fella ran for his life, bawling at the top of his lungs. His mother followed close behind, 2 of the wolves closing in and beginning to harry her. Suddenly, the other 5 wolves paused in the hunt as they noticed Chris. Lifting their heads, they changed their path and ran towards him, their light eyes shining. Already struggling with a fast run through the snow, Max saw the shaggy gray hunters and decided returning to the barn would be an excellent idea. The colt ducked back from one stride to the next, leaving Chris hanging halfway out of the saddle. Only a spur in the colt's offside momentarily saved Chris from landing in the deep snow, but Max's response to the spur digging in his side, coupled with the dogs running past him, the cows' aggressive bellowing, and the wolves' deep-throated growls, was to launch himself into a bucking fit. It only took Mac 2 bucks, each toss jarring Chris's teeth with the force of a hammer, to upend him into the nearest sagebrush. His hips and legs tangled in the tough branches, Chris quickly lifted his face and spat out a mouthful of snow. He watched Mac buck for several more strides, and as the McCarty rang, hung from the Bozell, one of Mac's front feet caught in the loop. The jerk on the bridle caused the colt to stop his bucking fit, but with his back still hunched. With a look, he took in his fallen rider and the hunting wolves. Giving a loud snort, the young horse ran towards the barn. Gracelessly, Chris crawled out of the sage on his hands and knees, shaking melting snow out of his eyes. Giving up on his mount, he turned towards the wolves, who were fast approaching. The little calf's mother now stood over her baby while the rest of the herd ran past. Barbed wire fences creaked as some cows jumped them, while others simply ran to put any kind of distance between themselves and the greedy hunters. The ranch dogs surged forward through the deep snow. They stood little chance against their bigger cousins, but fearlessly they went, growling and snarling in challenge. Running awkwardly through the drifts, the fringe of his chinks slapping against his jeans with every stride, Chris gathered his Tarin. His brow and cheeks burned as the fever scars became red, steam rising in the bitter air. He pointed a gloved finger at a heavy, dark gray male running towards him. A concentrated beam of fire flew from as hot as he could make it. He gave a triumphant shout as the thread almost sheared the hunter in half. Whining desperately, the predator crawled a few steps before collapsing, his lifeblood soaking the snow. The ranch dogs were now embroiled in a terrible melee. Their snarls and growls filled the air as they fought for their lives against 5 of the wolves. Chris continued to run up to close the distance. It was hard to get a clear target. The dogs and wolves were hopelessly enmeshed in their vicious contest. With some luck, he timed a skinny, light female's momentary retreat and let his fire fly from his fingertip again. Ecstasy coursed through him as his blaze hit her shaggy-coated spine. The huntress gave an agonized howl and sank into the snow, her fur releasing small lines of smoke. One of the ranch dogs now lay motionless in the churned snow as the rest continued to fight the intruders. Chris could spare no attention to which dog it was, but kept his steady advance, looking for another clear target. Closing in on the melee, his cheeks and brow burning, he reached deep to find all the fiery force he could bring forth. When another wolf jumped clear, Chris's Tarin seared through a front leg just below the shoulder. Wailing, the wolf tried to limp away, but his whines were abruptly cut off as Chris's next fiery stream smote him in the back of the neck. 3 more still fought the dogs while the cow watched a short distance away. Her calf lay at her feet, blood soaking the snow all around it. The 2 wolves who'd brought the calf down left it to its bellowing guardian mother and ran to attack Chris. Needing to reach the beleaguered dogs, he didn't pause in his stride, only turned his arm toward the wolves in their bright, gleaming eyes. He could clearly see their glee at the prospect of taking down a human. Chris's Tarin stream became a deadly, intense line. The wolves became blazing fireballs, screaming their pain as they fell writhing into the snow. That sweet, intense feeling of power ran through him again. At that moment, he had no thought of the canine's pain. He only saw the little baby calf that lay dying at its mother's feet. Taking large strides across the snow-filled meadow, he waded into the middle of the fight as the ecstasy rose to new heights. Sets retreated, coming to Chris's side, a large piece of bloody hide flapping from his shoulder. Standing almost directly over the dogs, Chris immolated another of the snarling predators. Rusty and Tidbit still stood their ground. Each time one of the 2 remaining wolves tried to jump for Chris, the faithful dogs sprung into its path. A long leap from a yellow-eyed male carried the wolf over Rusty and toward Chris's throat. He caught the shaggy predator in the air, and his fire flowed from one hand to the other. The wolf's scream was cut short as it burst into flames. When the carcass fell to the ground, its smoking coat sizzled against the snow, and Chris turned to the last wolf. But it was already fleeing with desperate whines. Tail tucked deep between its legs, The gray wolf streaked across the pasture and slunk through the fence. Reaching the shelter of the tree line along the creek, it looked back, its yellow eyes flashing as they regarded Chris resentfully. Suddenly exhausted, Chris sank to his knees. Sets came to him, his injury, flapping hide, exposing bloody and torn flesh to the freezing snow and ice, was terrible. With a small whine, the stalwart dog laid his head on Chris's knees. Chris tried to push the hide closed with shaking hands, but it was useless. It would have to be stitched. "We'll get you fixed up at the house, bud. Just hang there, okay?" He gave the big dog a careful pat. Then on his hands and knees, he crawled to Tilly's inert body. Little chunks of blood-soaked snow and ice sprinkled her coat, and her faithful eyes were now lifeless. A large pool of blood soaked into the ancient ground below her. Taking her head in his arms, he cradled her close. Tenderly, he kissed her just above each eye. He wished Trin were here, that the stout rancher could have witnessed his old dog's heroism. "You were a good dog, Tilly. Best dog anyone could have asked for. And I will tell Trin. Tell him about your last fight." He let her sink back down. Still on his knees, he called Rusty and Tidbit close. He ran his hands over them, searching for injuries. Thankfully, they had come out of the intense fight bearing only minor cuts and bite marks. Murmuring, good dog," at them, he rose to his feet. He was far from steady. Using his Tarin was hard work in and of itself, and now the adrenaline was deserting him. The cow, still standing over her dead calf not 50 feet away, snorted and shook her head at him. She nosed at her baby, made a mother's mooing noise, then snorted one more time. Relaxing his posture, he said, "You are one hell of a cow, Mama. I'll be back in a bit. We'll get you checked out." Retreating from her, he called the dogs close. The carcasses of the wolves dotted the snow in the crisp, clean pasture. Thick columns of smoke rose from several. The sight made Chris sick. It was one thing to know what you were capable of. It was a totally different thing to actually do it. He picked up Sets and made his way back across the pasture. As his footsteps scrunched through the heavy snow, the lonely howl of a wolf rose above the valley. On the ridge to the south, Chris spotted its dark outline against the early morning sky, its muzzle raised as it mourned its mates. He didn't have to walk far. Roland, Ada, and Tuff loped across the pasture, leading an unrepentant Mac by his McCarty lead. The columns of smoke had shown them the way. Chris handed the injured Sets to Roland. His friend gave a small, desperate groan at the state of the loyal dog. "The dogs did most of the work," Chris said. "I killed the wolves, but not fast enough." He indicated the dark, smoking mounds in the snow and the cow standing guard over her dead calf. "Tilly's over there." Tuff uttered a small cry and kicked his horse into a lope. Ada handed Mac's lead to Chris before hurrying after the younger kid. Much slower, gently carrying Sets, Roland followed them. Mac danced and jumped, refusing to let Chris mount. Chris only managed to swing aboard when he took the colt's head to the shoulder. But Mac was not done. As before, he lunged towards the barn, then began to buck. "Yeah, I thought you'd try that, you little bastard," Chris said as he rode Mac out of his fit. "That's not gonna work again, jackass!" The others joined him as he rode the colt in small circles, turning him this way and that, and having worked all night, the colt settled soon enough. Tuff carried Tilly's body as he rode, and Roland still had the injured Sets in his arms. When they returned to the barn, Chris was surprised to see his mother. She had caught her good horse, Shaky, and was saddling as they approached. She marched towards him as he rode in, pointing at him with her full hand. In her most authoritative voice, she said, "Christopher Richter, don't you ever scare me like that again." Exhaustion took over him as he dismounted. He had to lean against Mac's shoulder to stay upright. "I'm sorry, Mama," he murmured. "I couldn't help it." Crazy Kaylee was there as well. She hardly ever came to the barn where all the hard physical labor took place. Now she stood beside the tack room door, holding her dead pink phone in front of her and narrating their actions. "Ooh, it looks like Miss Mackenzie's not happy with her oldest son." And then, Rusty and little Tidbit seem to be okay, while Sets has to be carried by Roland. Tilly, the oldest cow dog, does not look alive anymore. Ada rounded on the dark-haired city girl. Stop it right now! Put that thing away or I'll throw it in the burn barrel. The amber-skinned influencer drew herself up to her full 5 foot and 8 inches, declaring, I have a right to film anywhere I want. Chris shook his head as he uttered a disgusted huff. Didn't matter if she pretended to take the videos, since her device was just as dead as all the others, but she happened to say things that made people realize their division. While Tilly and Sets were the Emerson's dogs, Rusty and Tidbit belonged to the Richters. All 4 dogs had thrown themselves at the wolves with no distinction. But according to Kaylee, it didn't matter that Tilly had been old and courageous, or that Sets by nature was not as fierce as Rusty. In her telling, the Richter dogs seemed fine, while the Emerson dogs had paid the price. Letty, leaving off petting Sets as he lay in Roland's arms, walked over to the influencer girl and took her phone out of her hand. Holding it out as if she was still recording, she said, We will take the time to mourn our dead companion now. Sounding off on Kaylee Latham's channel, this is Letty Richter. She used exaggerated motions to shut the device down and return it to Crazy Kaylee. With a menacing grin, she added, We can and we will take that away from you again. Make sure you remember that. In the wake of little Letty's threat, silence reigned over the barn for several long moments. Then Chris began to laugh. Look at you, sis, getting all tough on us. At his mother's request, he quickly recounted the wolves' attack, the dogs' valiant defense, and how 7 wolves had come to a burning end at the far side of their hayfield. Mackenzie pulled her thick sandy brown braid from her heavy coat. At least we won't have to call the game warden to tell him you just killed a whole pack of wolves. Roland, a little shorter than the tall ranch woman, shrugged with a laugh. There's that. With an apologetic smile, Mackenzie addressed Chris. I'm sorry, son, but you can't go to sleep just yet. You'll have to put out hay. She indicated the injured dog lying at her feet. Roland, you come with me to the doctor of this dog. Then she pointed at Crazy Kaylee. You, start packing snow from the big drift to the house. We'll need lots of boiling water. When Kaylee only gaped at her, the tough ranch woman said, Now, as fast as you can. Calling orders over her shoulder, she headed back toward the house. First, hay would have to be put out. Then, the dead calf and his mama would have to be put in a stall and doctored. Ada and Letty would ride out to find the cows that escaped to the north pasture, while the boys were to fix the hay meadows fence. Just before entering the house, she added, Don't worry about milking this morning. When we get done doctoring Sets, Kaylee and I will take care of it. With a comical expression, Tuff mounted his roan mare. Crazy Kaylee milking? What is the world coming to? Letty took one of the heavy wool saddle blankets from the rack. She gently wrapped Tilly's body into it, then laid it on the bench in the tack room. Chris wanted to tell her that was not a good place. The heat from the stove would cause Tilly's dead body to rot. But he didn't have the heart. Hopefully, Bruce and Trin would return the next day or so. Then they could bury Tilly the way she deserved. Feeding out on the hay meadows took up the morning. Eventually, Roland came from the house. Taking the rope to pull the next bale out to the cows, he directed Ada to begin gathering the escape cows off the BLM pasture. She called the dogs and headed out the gate, her horse's trot scattering snow from his hooves in a fine mist. Indicating the sounds from the barn, Chris asked, Is Mama really trying to milk with only Crazy Kaylee to help? Roland chuckled. No, that's your Taryn girl helping. Chris shot Roland a surprised look. She's up and around? His friend dismounted to push the heavy, sharp-tipped rod through one of the bales. Hooking the rope into position, he handed it to Chris while Tuff arranged the other one for Letty to drag. Roland shook fresh snow from his gloves. Right about the time we got done doctoring Sets, she came out to the kitchen. She ate a bite, and then she said she could help. He grinned wickedly, white teeth flashing through his black winter scruff. Only thing that scares me now is Crazy Kaylee is in charge of cooking for us. All by herself. Letty groaned as they began to drag the bale towards the hay meadow. That might make for an interesting supper. Tuff rode after her to cut the bale's net and gather it. How sets? The younger kid asked anxiously. Roland, his deep brown eyes full of worry, answered, He's okay for now. I got him on a bed in the house, wrapped and doctored. Mackenzie said he should be all right if he doesn't get an infection in that big wound. He just needs to rest. When Chris heard the old chute clacker open to catch the next cow, he tried to see how the Tarin girl was doing, but it was too difficult to see into the darker space inside the barn. He badly wished he could trade places with his mother. He longed for a chance to talk to the black-haired girl. Her experiences might differ wildly from his own, or they might not. She had the same scars across her cheeks and brow, marking her transformation. Has she suffered the same fever? Did she know of any others like them? And most importantly, what were her dreams telling her? Did all the Tarins really have to gather at a waterfall someplace northwest? Would he really have to set off? In this time of need, how could he abandon his family? Later that afternoon, as the sun shone across the ageless mountains, bathing everything in warm, brilliant light, Chris, Roland, Tuff, and Letty were almost finished fixing the fence the fleeing cows had broken. The job was infinitely more cumbersome with no pickup to carry the tools. Suddenly, Letty pointed at the southern ridge with a yelp. Long string of horses traversed the cedars and sage, steadily trotting towards the ranch. Roland whooped and threw his hand up to wave. That's Dad and Bruce in the lead! Letty began to laugh her relief. Her young, feminine voice echoed across the snow-filled flats as she imitated Roland's call. Then she said, But I don't think those following are any of our neighbors. Chris watched the horses and riders descend. Of the 3 extra riders, only one looked like they knew how to sit a horse. The other 2 wobbled and bobbed in the saddle as if they were bouncing on a drunken rail. 7 pack horses followed the riders, 2 more than the dads had left with. He stuffed his pliers into his saddlebags and said, That's good enough. Roland chuckled his agreement. They had fixed most of the fence, except for the last bottom wire. With a smile, Chris gathered up his tools and mounted his horse. With a few semi-guilty grins, the others followed his lead. They hurried to open the gate beside the cattle guard at the ranch entrance, allowing the riders and pack horses through. Smiling, Bruce and Trin thanked them. They didn't break their pace as they led the rest up the drive. As the riders swept past, Chris examined the ones he didn't recognize. A young family, the wife riding deftly with a small baby strapped to her back. Her husband and son, a boy of about 11 or 12, didn't even come close to the smooth skill she seemed to have. Notwithstanding, they all made it up to the barn. Barely pausing to greet the youngsters, Bruce and Trin quickly directed unloading of the pack horses. Crazy Kaylee came up for the house to record the group's arrival on her pink phone, but a sharp call from Trin made her put the device in her back pocket. With a sulk, she retreated back to the kitchen. Just as Chris wondered why his mother wasn't coming to help with the arrivals, he heard the telltale sounds of a heifer struggling to give birth. Quickly, he ran down to the barn. Inside, his mother was wielding the calf pullers, her hands and arms covered in birthing fluids. Jesselyn, at Mackenzie's direction, was pulling on the slippery calf, trying to ease the hips out of the birth canal. Chris took the calf pullers from his mother's hands. I'll take over. You better have Dad and Trin. She smiled her appreciation and rose from the corral dirt to switch places with him. She briefly stopped to wash her arms off at the water barrel and went up to the house. He sat down behind the heifer and worked the calf pullers. The young cow, already laying down, gave another bawl, and the last of the calf came out of her with a rush of fluids. Using the chains, he tugged the black, wet baby free. Jesselyn laughed in delight as the calf shook its head and took its first breath. Oh my gosh! That is the coolest thing ever! He directed her to drag the newborn into one of the calving stalls while gently urging the heifer to her feet and out of the chute. Jesselyn's little red and white dog tried to one of the corral panels, barked as the heifer unsteadily passed, but she joined her calf with only a disdainful look at the pup. Bundled in her borrowed heavy coat, her long black hair escaping in loose strands out of her stocking cap, Jesselyn leaned her elbows on the fence rail. She watched the baby calf with fascination. Chris pulled her away. Leave him alone. They'll do better if they have privacy. Then he cleaned up the area, putting the calf pullers back to their spot and sprinkling lime across the base of the chute. Jesselyn stood aside, watching his practiced routine. "Can I help you with anything?" He shook his head. "Almost done." She untied her dog from the panel, pet him briefly, then allowed him to run loose. While the pup sniffed around the barn, she indicated the noisy goings-on in the ranch yard. "Maybe we should go help?" Chris smiled and answered, "They got it. Sit tight." Then with a direct gaze, he said, "I haven't had a chance to talk to you." He would have led her to the warmth of the tack room, but remembered that Tilly still lay on the bench in there. Visibly steeling herself, she squared her shoulders. "What do you want to know, Taryn? Or should I address you as Focus?" Chris grimaced. "Focus? What the hell is that?" Protest all he wanted, he knew dang well what that was. Or rather, who. Holding up staying hands, he said, "Never mind that. I want to know about you. Did you get a fever? I did. You wouldn't have to burn the house down, but did you..." With a pained grimace, she sighed deeply. Ask me anything else, Chris, please." As the hubbub of people unloading horses and stowing supplies continued in the yard, she added, "Yes, there was a terrible fever. Then afterward, I got these blisters across my face." Chris nodded. It had been much of the same for him. However, he couldn't imagine her surviving the illness alone. She continued, indicating the slightly blue marks. "As they've healed, they turned into these." Her eyes, normally almost black, changed to a glow of vivid blue, and her scars became more pronounced as she let the Terran inside her rise briefly. In response, he allowed his own Terran to strengthen. He knew his eyes would hold a red, fiery glow, even as the scars across his face grew more distinct. Then he asked, "Do you have dreams now?" He paused, almost embarrassed to speak the fantastical concepts aloud. But she only shrugged to her agreement. Freymatuk and Sand Pet, and their struggle against each other. Then she fixed him with her normal black-eyed gaze. "Sand Pet wants to destroy humanity. And if we don't let Freymatuk help us, that evil god will win." Chris couldn't help it. He buried his head in his hands to growl with frustration. He didn't know if he believed all that. Yet, in his sleep, his dreams warned him of that dire future. I can't leave. I can't leave my family, my home. They need me." With a huff, she responded, "You can't not leave. It's kind of nebulous for me. I might just lose my Terran if I don't find the place she's calling us to, but you?" Carefully, she touched his shoulder and continued, "You are the fire Focus. If you don't go, you'll be driven." Before he could answer or protest, Roland entered the barn, loudly banging the door against the wall. "Hey, lovebirds! Quit hiding and help us put the horses away." Jesselyn took her hand off Chris's shoulder as if she was scalded. Chris gave an abashed laugh and rolled his eyes. "Damn it, Roland. I've only talked to the girl twice. It's not like we're making out down here." Nevertheless, as they left the barn, he held the door for her and her little pup. Trin's two top dogs, Woody and Jack, spotted the new pup and immediately began to attack him. At the older rancher's sharply shouted reprimands, they reluctantly allowed Jesselyn's dog to follow at her heels. Very closely. Chris couldn't help but chuckle a little bit. In this working environment, the little dog would soon learn excellent manners. He walked over and hugged his father, then thumped fists with Trin. He was glad they were back safely. As the older men organized the unsaddling and horse turnout, they related news from town. The people there had for sure lost several old and sickly people to medical emergencies. They had managed to keep everyone else fed, using donated cattle from the surrounding ranchers and commandeered grain from the feed stores. However, fresh foods like milk, butter, and vegetables were in very short supply. The saddles were put away, and the horses, several more than they'd left with, turned out onto the hay meadows with the cows for the night. Trin grinned at Chris, Roland, and Tuff as he said, I took contracts for 3 teams and wagons to be built and delivered in the next few months. You boys and Mr. John here," he indicated the young couple who'd arrived with him, "can take some of the lighter cars and convert them to wagons. If Miss Mackenzie is willing, we'll let Miss Coral run the house." He turned his gray bearded face to Chris's mother, saying, "And then you can train a few wagon teams. They are badly needed now." Mackenzie cast her eyes on the small woman cradling her tiny baby close. He could see the relief on her face. She'd taken the job as head cook and bottle washer without complaint. It needed to be done. But he knew that she missed being outside, working with the horses and cattle. Her face broke out in a slow smile, and she nodded gladly. Chris's own response was more measured as he caught Jesselyn's eyes. Converting the undercarriages of the small cars would involve precision ironwork, something only he was capable of doing. He shrugged at her, then turned to Trin. "Yeah, that'll work." He was needed here. He couldn't leave his people, his family. Not now. Not when things were teetering on the edge of survival for everyone. Maybe later. But probably not. This is Camon, reading Wyoming Tarins Rising, calving season. This was a story from the Wyoming Tarin Rising series. If you've listened this far, you owe us a like, and if you enjoyed it, you should subscribe as well. The story was narrated by Camon Rain and is written by Ashakery Dart. This story and artwork is copyrighted on January 15th, 2025. Check for updates coming up soon, and be sure to subscribe.